So we're down to our last two principles for interpreting prophecy. And then we're going to talk about how to understand figurative language and types and symbols. But first, the principle number 8, we need to interpret, you should interpret prophecy, interpret scripture like a story that's moving forward. So I want you to think about a movie as an example. The movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Both the Nazis and Indiana Jones are after this bronze medallion, this headpiece to the staff of Ra, and they're looking for it. And you can, once you have this medallion, you put it on top of a staff that's a certain length, and you insert it into a certain place in the map room in the lost city of Tanis. The sun will shine through a crystal in the center of the medallion and beam onto the floor and show where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. Very serious business. It's not biblical, but don't worry about that. So they're after this medallion. The Nazis don't get the medallion, but they do get one side of the medallion. It's been the inscription, the medallion shape has been burned onto the palm of a sinister Nazi henchman. And the inscription tells them information about how tall to make the staff that they'll attach the medallion to. And so they have some of the information on the god burned into the guy's palm, but they don't have all the information. They only have one side of the inscription. The side they have does tell them how tall the staff should be, but the other side that they're missing tells them to subtract a certain portion from the height, and that's how tall the staff should be. So the Nazis are never going to find the Well of the Souls where the Ark of the Covenant is kept unless they have both sides of the inscription. It's not that the Nazis had wrong information, it's that they had incomplete information. They needed both sides of the headpiece to the staff of Ra. Stories go forward. We constantly refine our understanding of the whole as we get more information. The Bible is a story, and it works the same way. We interpret what we read in light of what we now know is the full story. New information builds on the old information and gives it more color. So as we think about going back to the Bible as an 8-episode miniseries from our first video, the Bible is about God's promise to send his only son, Jesus, our King, to choose and rescue a special community to be with him forever in his coming kingdom. So if that's a true summary of the Bible's story, if that's what the story's about, then we should interpret various bits of that story in light of the whole. When we read Leviticus, we should interpret it in light. The full significance is only clear in light of what we now know about Jesus and what he came to do. We read back truths we now know into what came before because we have more information than the original audience did because we're further along in the story. We interpret the older revelation in light of what we now know about Christ, the cross, the gospel, and the kingdom's first victories over darkness. And this picture on the screen puts it really well. We interpret the bits and pieces in light of what we now know is the whole story because we've been given the whole story. Sometimes we wish we had more details about how the story ends, but we have the story. We have the basic story. We have more than the basic story. So let me give you an example. Take the idea of Israel. What is Israel? And as I go through this very briefly, there's a lot more that I could say, but I just wanted you to see that the story the shape grows as the story goes on. So in our Bible as mini-series, in episode 3, the man from Ur, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he reaffirms it to his offspring, Isaac and Jacob. Lots of promises in Genesis 12 and then 18 and 21, but this promise has an ethnic flavor. His family will be the conduit for blessing to the nations. It's an Abraham thing. It's a Jewish thing. But as the story goes on, we see that Israel has expanded beyond just Abraham and his genetic, descendants, beyond Abraham and his descendants. Tamar, who's a forerunner of King David and Jesus, is likely a Canaanite. Joseph himself marries an Egyptian woman in Genesis 41:50. Moses has 2 wives in Scripture, and they're both foreigners. Neither of them are Jewish. We assume they came to join the family, but they're not ethnic Israelites. One is the daughter, Zipporah, is the daughter of a Midianite priest, and the other is a black woman, a Cushite, whose ancestry draws criticism and strong rebuke from God. Phineas, Aaron's grandson, is likely a black man. Foreign-born believers can celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover, which means they're part of the family. Jesus is descended from Ruth, who's a Moabite. She is not an Israelite. She's not Jewish. God explicitly, in Isaiah 56, he explicitly welcomes foreigners. He says, I will gather still others to them besides those already gathered. In eternity, Assyria, Isaiah says in Isaiah 19, verses 23 to 25, Assyria will be God's handiwork, and Egypt his people. So basically, Old Covenant Israel is not a Jewish thing. It's a people defined less by a strict race or ethnicity and more by an alleged faith in God, in Yahweh. So we've expanded from Abraham and his physical descendants. Now we're into Abraham, his physical descendants, and a whole bunch of other people who can join and are welcomed and are given privileged places, honored, even forerunners of the Messiah himself. And then later, way later, in episode 7, Light in the Darkness, which is the Gospels and Acts and the New Covenant Church, the Apostle Peter deliberately takes language from Exodus 19, where God's people are called a treasured possession, the kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And he takes language from Hosea about how you weren't my people, but now you've become my people. And he applies it to the new covenant community today in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And in the same episode, episode 7, the Apostle Paul takes those exact same passages from Hosea 1 and Hosea 2, and they're talking about the Old Covenant nation, and he applies them to us. And the us is this new covenant community of Jews and Gentiles. And that's in Romans chapter 9, verses 24 and 26. And he says that's about us. So there's an expansion of understanding going on here from what the original audience would have understood. But as the story goes on, it doesn't erase what the original audience would have understood, but it broadens it out in ways that we have to take into account. And then all the way to the end, in episode 8, Light of the World, we see the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, this new creation. It has 12 gates with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it also has 12, its foundation stones for its wall have the 12 apostles' names on the foundation stones. This single city where Father and Son rule bears the names of the tribes of Israel and the apostles, the two peoples who comprise the one flock Jesus said he's come to gather in John chapter 10, verse 16. So we need to back up, we need to find that front door to Scripture, to orient ourselves. If not, we're going to enter through some strange side door and be really confused. We'll enter through Isaiah 24 and we'll wander around forever being really confused. This story won't seem like a story. It'll seem like a bunch of fragmented, strange little vignettes that we can't make sense of. How do they fit together? So remember what the story's about. God's promise to send his only son, Jesus, our King, to choose and rescue a special community to be with him forever in his coming kingdom. And so based on the whole story, as we see the shape blossoming out, Israel, we could conclude, are all true believers, Jews and Gentiles, who comprise the family that God has been gathering for his kingdom. And I say that because we interpret the parts in light of the whole story. Now, there's a lot there about the statement I just made, and this isn't a video where I'm going to defend that, but that would be my conclusion and an application of what I mean when I say we read the bits of Scripture in light of what we now know is the whole story. So, for example, when we read the letter to the Hebrews, and then we go back to Leviticus with fresh eyes to behold Jesus, foreshadowed in all of those sacrifices. It isn't that we couldn't understand Leviticus before. It's that now we can see it so much better. So go back to Raiders of the Lost Ark. When the French archaeologist Belloc sees Indiana Jones digging up the Well of Souls up on the hillside at dawn, he doesn't hesitate. They go and they arrest them, and then he imprisons Dr. Jones inside the Well of Souls now that he's found it for him. Now, Belloc didn't say, oh, he can't have found it. We have the inscription, and it means what it says. He didn't do that. He found out what had happened, and then he immediately realized that Indiana Jones, had fuller information. The half of the inscription Belloc had was not wrong. It was just incomplete. He could never have fathomed the true color, the true significance, the true location of the Well of Souls unless he had both sides of the inscription. So again, it's not that the information we have in the Old Testament is wrong. It's that it was incomplete without the addition of the whole. That's how stories work. They go forward, and then as new things happen, they give fuller light to things we saw before. That's why in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, earlier in the movie, when Belloc and Indiana Jones are sitting in the cafe, Belloc has this fervor in his eyes about wanting to find the Ark. And he says the Ark is a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God, and it's within my reach. And that sort of strange fanaticism only really shows its significance at the end of the movie, when Belloc pretends to be almost an Old Testament high priest and is dressed in the robe with the breastplate and a headpiece and all sorts of strange things, and almost pretends he is an Old Testament high priest and opens the ark and kills himself and everyone else. But when we see him dressed like that now, when we think back to this weird sort of fanaticism he had about wanting to find the ark and what it can do, we get a fuller sense of this strange guy and his own reasons for finding the ark, which are much different from De Fuhrer's. So the Bible story moves forward, shedding more light on what was already revealed. And we should interpret it that way, interpret the Bible, interpret the parts of the Bible in light of what we now know is the whole. And that leads us to the last principle before we get into the types of language and prophecy. Principle number 9. Literal isn't always literal. There's a lot of foreshadowing that goes on in Scripture. So if we can agree that the events and promises earlier in the story foreshadow and prefigure later better things, then we should, only when the Bible gives us permission, we should interpret prophecy using what one writer has called an expanded typological principle, meaning there's a lot of foreshadowing in the early parts of the Bible that prefigure or point to or strongly hint at fulfillment later. So if Jesus interpreted the Old Testament with himself as the key, which is what he did with those two disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, then we should do the same. We should interpret the Scripture with Jesus and his mission to form a community as the key. And if there's foreshadowing going on where one thing points to a greater and better fulfillment, then the fulfillment of prophecy isn't always going to take the exact form that it literally says in the Old. So if you think about it, Scripture often describes future things with language from the past. Creation was made in the beginning. There will be a new and better creation at the end. The tree of life is in Eden. The tree of life pops back in Revelation 22 in the new creation. This corrupt world was once judged by water. And Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 3, says it will also be judged by fire. The smoldering ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah seem to inspire the Apostle John's description of the eternal smoldering hellfire in Revelation 14:11 and 19:3. The smoke rises up forever. So this isn't a license to not care about what the text says. It's just acknowledging that we interpret the parts in light of the fulfillment we see in the whole. So here's a real practical example. Should you think that you've been lied to if, when you see God face to face, if you're a Christian, if God does not have a chest of glowing metal as if of fire? That's from Ezekiel 1:27. What if God does not have the radiance of a rainbow? Ezekiel 1:28. What if God does not look like jasper or ruby? Revelation 4, verse 3. What if there is literally not a sea of glass before God's real throne? Revelation 4:6. Now, you would never think you were lied to. We know that God looks better and more awesome than glowing metal, rainbows, or jasper, or polished glass, right? We know that. So when we read descriptions like that, we don't read them and say, better be glass or it's over for me. We just take the point and let those descriptions paint pictures in our mind, in our hearts, and then we read on. We don't cling to them and say, where's the glowing metal? So that's what I mean when I say there's a lot of foreshadowing going on, where future events are depicted in language of the past, pointing to a better kind of fulfillment. So if it's correct to read the parts of the story in light of the whole, then we have to let the story interpret itself. That's the end of the 9 principles for interpreting prophecy. We have 3 left, 3 videos left. We're going to talk about how to interpret the unique language of Scripture. So join us for that, and we'll learn about figurative language next time.